Welcome to Vale Marks, where stories of heartache, hope, and the power of love unfold. Before you dive into this tale, take a moment to reflect on these words by the famous poet Rainer Maria Rilke. The purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things. It is in those moments of loss and struggle that we truly find our purpose, our strength, and our connection to the world around us. In the story you're about to hear, we follow Max, a loyal dog who waits for years for a family that may never return. But his journey will teach us all that love, even when silent, speaks louder than words. Keep watching until the end, for this is not just a story. It is a reminder of the power of memory, of patience, and of love that never fades. It started with the sound of sirens cutting through the mountain air. Flashing red and blue lights pierced the fog as emergency responders rushed to the scene of a late-night car accident. The road was narrow and winding, one of those quiet mountain highways that locals avoided after dark. That night, though, the silence had been shattered. A delivery truck had lost control at the bend and slammed into a guardrail. No one was seriously injured, but debris littered the asphalt, and the road had to be closed until further notice. The scene was routine. Officers directed traffic, emergency lights blinked steadily in the darkness, and cones were set up to block off the dangerous stretch. Locals, drawn by curiosity or concern, had gathered near the edge of the yellow tape, murmuring quietly among themselves. Everything felt strangely calm, almost too calm, as if the mountain was holding its breath. Then, just as the officers began to wrap up the last bit of paperwork, something unusual happened. From the edge of the trees came the soft crunch of paws against gravel. A large pit bull, lean and muscular with a brindle coat of deep brown streaked with faded black, emerged from the darkness. No one saw exactly where he came from, but he walked with purpose, straight past the startled onlookers and police, and sat down in the middle of the road, right at the heart of the blocked-off section. At first, everyone assumed he belonged to someone nearby. One of the officers casually walked toward the dog, attempting to usher him away from the scene. But the pit bull didn't move. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't even flinch. He simply sat, his posture tense, ears perked, eyes fixed on the thick forest ahead as if waiting for something. Or someone. Another officer approached, this time with a more forceful tone. Still, the dog refused to budge. Several minutes passed, then 10, then 20. It became clear this wasn't a random stray who had wandered into the scene by accident. This dog was here for a reason. "He's guarding something," someone whispered from the crowd. The pit bull's eyes glistened in the artificial light, wide and unwavering, scanning the shadows beyond the trees. There was no fear in his gaze, only fierce, unwavering determination. It was the kind of look that made people hesitate before stepping closer, unsure whether they were intruding on something sacred. Attempts were made to remove him. A nearby animal control officer tried to coax the dog away with gentle words and bits of food. The dog didn't respond. A firefighter even tried to lift him gently by the chest. But the moment his hands touched the dog's fur, the animal let out a low, almost inaudible whine. Not a warning, not aggression, just sorrow. A sound so full of loss it made the man pause, swallow hard, and step back. The night grew colder, mist curling around the trees like breath from a sleeping giant. Still, the pit bull didn't move. He just sat there, legs folded beneath him, tail wrapped tightly to his side, as if anchoring himself to that very spot. Occasionally, he would shift slightly to reorient his gaze, always toward the same patch of forest. His stillness was unnatural, uncanny, and slowly it began to affect those around him. People started speaking in hushed tones. An old woman crossed herself. A teenager nervously asked if anyone had heard ghost stories about this stretch of road. A young officer checked his notes again, then glanced at the dog, then back at the trees, his brow furrowed like something didn't quite add up. And then came the question that shifted the mood entirely. What if he's waiting for someone who never came back? The Pitbull's presence, once just a strange inconvenience, now felt like a message, an unanswered question hanging in the cold night air. Why this dog? Why here? Why now? As the hours passed, the scene slowly emptied. The road remained closed, but the emergency crews had packed up most of their equipment. Only a few officers remained, along with a handful of onlookers too intrigued to leave. The dog never moved, not even when headlights flickered in the distance, or when the wind carried the scent of pine and ash from the woods. Eventually, one of the senior officers called in a temporary barrier to be placed around the dog, just in case. "We'll come back in the morning," he said, trying to sound pragmatic, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That night, no one knew his name. No one knew where he came from or why he sat exactly where he did. All they knew was that he wasn't leaving, not until someone listened, not until someone remembered. And so, in the dead of night, under a blanket of stars and silence, a lone pit bull stood watch, steadfast, unmoving, and heartbreakingly patient, as if guarding the invisible echo of a story no one had finished telling. By the time the morning sun began to break through the mist that clung to the mountain road, whispers of the strange dog had already begun to ripple through the nearby town. It started with a few curious bystanders who had witnessed the night's events, then spread through local diner chatter, morning radio snippets, and community group posts on social media. A photo taken from a distance, grainy, dimly lit, captured the image of a pit bull sitting in the middle of the closed road, framed by fog and flashing lights. The caption read simply, "He hasn't moved all night." The story became a mystery people couldn't stop thinking about. Why was this dog there? What was he waiting for? And why that exact spot? By noon, more people began driving up the narrow highway just to see the dog for themselves. The authorities, unsure what to do, allowed foot traffic through the side of the blockade. Some came out of fascination, others from concern. Children held onto their parents' hands as they peeked around the trees. Elderly folks brought lawn chairs and flasks of coffee, settling down at a respectful distance. The air buzzed with quiet speculation. "He must have been with the accident," someone said. "No, the dog wasn't there last night. I was here. He showed up later," replied a man who worked roadside assistance. "Maybe he's waiting for someone who never came back," someone whispered, and that idea stuck. The longer the dog stayed, the more unsettling it became. Hours turned into a full day. The pit bull never barked, never begged for food or water, never lay down. He simply sat, still as stone, eyes locked on the same stretch of trees across the road. His presence wasn't aggressive or fearful. It was something else, something deeper. There was a grief about him, or perhaps a duty. That afternoon, Ellie drove up to the scene. She hadn't planned on going. She'd heard about the dog on the local news and scrolled past the posts online. But something about the way people described him, the silence, the stillness, the staring, pulled at her in a way she couldn't quite explain. She was 24, lived alone in a modest apartment above a bookstore downtown, and worked odd hours at the county museum. She didn't believe in ghosts or spiritual signs, but she did believe in instinct, and that morning, when she saw the picture of the dog, something shifted in her chest, like a whisper from somewhere she couldn't name. When Ellie arrived, she parked behind a line of other cars and quietly made her way up the hill. The air had that early winter bite, crisp, dry, and filled with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. As she approached the crowd, she spotted the dog immediately. He sat exactly as the stories described, a brindle pit bull with a powerful build and weather-worn eyes. His body was still, but his gaze was sharp, unwavering, fixed on the trees as though he could see something no one else could. Ellie felt the chill before the wind even touched her skin. It wasn't just the cold. It was something else. A strange ache beneath her ribs, a heaviness behind her eyes. She stopped walking and just stood there, taking in the sight. The dog reminded her of something she couldn't place. Not someone she'd met, not a memory. It was deeper than that, like an echo of a dream she used to have but had long since forgotten. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed down the mountain, rustling branches and sending a ripple through the crowd. People pulled their jackets tighter. A few leaves blew across the road and brushed against the Pitbull's front paws. He didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked forward. Ellie stepped closer, careful not to disturb the quiet reverence that had settled over the scene. She stopped just a few feet behind the makeshift barrier the police had set up. She knelt slowly, her knees brushing the gravel, and stared at the dog. He didn't turn to look at her, but she felt something pass between them, a silent exchange of presence. His eyes, full of something too deep to name, stirred something inside her. It felt like grief, like waiting, like love left behind. She didn't know where the feeling came from, but she suddenly had the urge to speak. "You've been here all night?" she said softly, not expecting a response. The Pitbull didn't move. "You're waiting for someone, aren't you?" Still no reaction, but Ellie saw something, just the tiniest flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not confusion, just pain, quiet, patient pain. She remained there for several minutes, ignoring the murmurs behind her, the curious stares. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt connected to something beyond herself, something wordless and ancient. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the road, the air turned colder again. A fresh breeze swept down from the hills, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and moss. Still, the Pitbull didn't move. People eventually trickled back to their cars, retreating into the warmth of heaters and fleece-lined jackets. But Ellie stayed. She didn't know why. She only knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. Because somehow, in some inexplicable way, this wasn't just a dog sitting on a road. This was something more. A messenger. A witness. A keeper of something that mattered deeply. And Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that if she left now, she'd be walking away from something sacred. Something unfinished. So she sat with him in the cold, shoulder to shoulder, her presence a quiet promise. "I see you. I don't know what you're waiting for, but I'm not leaving either." The image of the dog haunted Ellie for days after she returned from that mountain road. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he sat, motionless, eyes fixed on something unseen, as if tethered to a memory that refused to fade. There was something deeply human in the dog's stillness, something raw and aching, like grief carved into flesh. She tried to go back to her routines, work at the museum, morning coffee runs, quiet evenings with a book, but none of it felt real anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those eyes again, silent, searching, waiting. She wasn't sleeping well. And more than once, she found herself turning her car toward that same road, just to see if the dog was still there. He was. Every time. Same spot, same silence, same unwavering stare into the forest beyond. By the fourth day, Ellie stopped pretending this was just a passing curiosity. This wasn't about a dog anymore. This was about a story begging to be uncovered, and something deep inside her, something old and unresolved, wouldn't let her rest until she knew what it was. So she took a day off work and headed for the county sheriff's office, not the shiny new building downtown, but the older annex tucked behind the courthouse. That was where they kept archived case files, dusty cabinets filled with paper memories the world had long since forgotten. A receptionist gave her a puzzled look when she explained what she was looking for. "You said the accident was where exactly?" the woman asked, tapping her keyboard slowly. About 4 miles past mile marker 12 on Route 6, Ellie replied. Just before the trailhead sign, near that old roadside turnout. The woman blinked, then turned to an officer in the hallway. That's near Whispering Ridge, right? The officer paused, then nodded. Yeah. A family went missing up there a couple years back. Never found them. Ellie felt her breath catch. The officer, whose name tag read Garza, led her into the records room. He didn't seem thrilled about digging through old files, but something in Ellie's voice must have struck a chord. Together, they pulled down several boxes labeled Missing Persons, 2020. The fluorescent lights above flickered as the dust stirred from long-forgotten folders. Pages yellowed with age, filled with typed reports, photos, maps, and scribbled notes. It didn't take long to find the file. Case number 2020-1479. Subjects: James and Dana Whitmore. Daughter, Lily Whitmore, age 6. Status: missing, presumed deceased. Ellie read the report slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned each page. According to the documents, the Whitmore family had been driving from their home in Cedar Valley to a weekend cabin rental deeper in the mountains. Their last known stop had been a gas station just outside of town, where a security camera had captured them buying snacks and chatting with the clerk. From there, they vanished. Their car was never found. No bodies, no tire marks leading off the road. Just nothing. The file was filled with satellite images, interviews, and even failed search grid maps. Search parties had combed the area for weeks, but eventually, the case went cold. And then Ellie saw it, buried near the end of the file. A witness report from a hiker who claimed to have seen a family pulled over at the turnout by mile marker 12. The description matched the Whitmores. The hiker didn't think much of it at the time, except for one detail. They had a dog, the hiker had written. A big brindle Pitbull sitting in the back seat, calm, friendly-looking. The little girl called him Max. Ellie felt her pulse spike. Maximum. The name seemed to echo in her ears. She reached for her phone and pulled up the photo she had taken of the dog on the mountain road. The same muscular build. The same deep brown coat streaked with darker shades. And most of all, the same expression. Quiet, mournful, waiting. Was it possible? Could this be the same dog? 2 years, 2 winters, 2 summers. Could a dog survive that long alone in the wild, only to return to the exact spot his family was last seen? Ellie didn't know, but her gut whispered yes, and the longer she stared at the file, the more she felt like this wasn't coincidence. This was connection. Max hadn't just wandered onto that road by chance. He had come back to wait, to remember, to hold space for the ones he loved. She gently closed the file, heart pounding with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. The pieces were starting to come together, and they pointed to something far more profound than she had expected. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Ellie looked up at the mountains in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow, quiet and watchful. Somewhere up there, Max had waited alone, through storms, through seasons, through silence. And now, maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone to wait with him. Ellie couldn't stay away. After discovering the old police file and reading the name Max etched into the memory of a missing family, something inside her had shifted. It was no longer just curiosity. It had become personal, an invisible thread pulling her deeper into a mystery long buried beneath time and silence. She began her quiet investigation, starting with the simplest tools she had: a notebook, a camera, a folder of printed documents, and a gut feeling she couldn't ignore. She returned to the mountain turnout with fresh eyes, this time not just to see the dog, but to listen, to every crack in the gravel, to every whisper of wind rustling through the pine trees. Max, the brindle Pitbull, was still there, still seated, still staring. Ellie approached quietly and stood several feet behind him, studying the space beyond his gaze. She imagined what that road might have looked like 2 years ago. A family car pulled over, a child laughing in the back seat, a dog with bright eyes, tail wagging, and then nothing, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Over the next few days, Ellie poured herself into the search for answers. She tracked down old news articles, community message board posts, even stopped by the tiny general store where the Whitmores had reportedly filled their gas tank that day. The clerk, a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and fading tattoos, didn't remember much, just that the little girl had hugged her dog tight before they left, and the family seemed happy. They were talking about some cabin, he recalled. Said it was supposed to be the last vacation before the dad started a new job. That thread, the last vacation, hung in Ellie's mind as she traced the trail the family might have taken. She pulled up maps, compared search party notes, and eventually, with the help of a ranger at the state park office, found mention of an old hiking trail that split off from the main road not far from the turnout. It had long been overgrown and removed from official maps after a landslide damaged part of it a few years back. But Ellie had a hunch. On a cold morning layered in flannel and resolve, she followed the faint line of that forgotten trail. Fallen branches cracked beneath her boots. Patches of frost clung to the earth in shaded hollows. Birds scattered when she passed, and the only sound was the soft rhythm of her breath and the crunch of old leaves. The trail led her deeper into the trees, winding down a gentle slope. After about a half-mile, the air felt heavier, the trees denser. She slowed down, watching for anything out of place. That's when she noticed the narrow runoff ditch beside the path, partially filled with dead leaves and pebbles. Something metallic glinted faintly in the dirt. She crouched, brushed the leaves away, and uncovered a small rusted object, a dog collar, weathered and brittle, with the leather cracked like an old book spine. Her breath caught when she saw the tag still clinging to its ring. She lifted it gently, wiped off the grime, and revealed a name etched in faint but unmistakable letters. Max. Ellie froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, her fingers trembling as she turned the tag over. On the back, a faded phone number barely clung to visibility. She didn't need to call it. She already knew whose it was. The collar had been buried just off the trail, not far from where Max now sat, waiting, day after day. The odds of it ending up there by chance were too small. This had to be the place. Something happened here. She stood slowly, her mind racing. Had Max returned to this spot after his family vanished? Had he tried to lead someone back here? Had anyone listened? And yet, why was the collar off? Had it slipped off during a struggle? Had someone taken it off? The questions piled up, but alongside them bloomed something else, an eerie sense of connection. Ellie felt it again, stronger now, the invisible thread between her and the dog, pulling tighter with every new discovery. When she returned to the road, Max was still there. The collar, now in a Ziploc bag in her backpack, felt warm against her spine. She sat cross-legged a few feet from him and, without thinking, said aloud, "I found it." Max didn't move, didn't look her way. But his ears twitched, and his body shifted, just slightly, as though something in her voice had reached him. She didn't expect him to leap into her lap or wag his tail. That wasn't who Max was. He wasn't a pet waiting to be rescued. He was a guardian, a sentry bound to something deeper than obedience, a protector of memory, a keeper of love lost. Ellie sat beside him for a long time, the afternoon sun slowly sliding behind the trees. She thought of the little girl, Lily, of her parents, of the plans they must have had, the dreams that ended the moment their car disappeared into silence. And she thought of Max, how he'd stayed behind, all this time, carrying the weight of what the world forgot. As the shadows lengthened across the road, Ellie made a silent vow. She wasn't going to forget. She would follow the trail, wherever it led. Because some truths don't stay buried forever, not when someone is still out there waiting to be found. The days that followed were a blur of thoughts, quiet walks, and sleepless nights. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was close, tangible even, but just out of reach, like a whisper carried away by the wind. Every time she visited Max, she caught herself staring into the same stretch of forest he watched so intently. He never looked at her, never moved when she arrived. His gaze was always fixed on that one silent point, deep in the trees beyond the road. It was more than habit, more than instinct. It was purpose. That afternoon, Ellie decided to follow it. She waited until the sun had begun its slow descent and the air had cooled. She brought a flashlight, a compass, and a bottle of water, just in case. Before stepping off the road, she paused by Max. The dog, as usual, didn't react, but Ellie gave him a quiet nod, like they had an unspoken agreement. And then she stepped into the trees. The forest was thick and tangled, untouched in years. Twigs snapped beneath her boots, and old leaves whispered as they stirred in her path. She walked slowly, carefully, using Max's line of sight as her invisible guide. The deeper she went, the quieter it got, the more distant the world felt. Time no longer moved in minutes, but in heartbeats. After what felt like nearly an hour of cautious hiking, she reached a dip in the terrain. A narrow ravine stretched below, lined with old roots and moss-covered stone. At the bottom, she spotted a dry creek bed, the kind that only carried water during heavy rains. And there, nestled between jagged rocks, was a crevice in the earth. A natural fissure, maybe 10 feet wide, like the mountain itself had cracked open in a quiet act of grief. Ellie's breath caught. She scrambled down, careful not to slip, and approached the mouth of the crevice. The air around it was cooler, stiller, heavy with the scent of damp soil and pine. Something about it felt untouched, sacred. She knelt beside the edge and looked down. The shadows inside were thick, but with the help of her flashlight, she spotted something unnatural below the moss and debris. A flash of metal, a glint of glass. Her pulse quickened. It was a car. Most of it was buried beneath years of rockfall, mud, and leaves. But enough was exposed to recognize the roofline, the dull curve of a window, and the remnants of a license plate long faded by time. Ellie's hands trembled as she backed away and reached for her phone. By the time the rescue team arrived, the light was fading from the forest canopy. Officers, forest rangers, and a search and recovery unit quickly descended into the ravine with ropes and tools. Max remained at the roadside, watching as if he knew, finally, they were going to see what he'd been trying to tell them all along. Ellie stood nearby as they worked. She didn't speak. She just watched, heart in her throat, while men in uniforms carefully unearthed what had been hidden for 2 long years. It didn't take long to confirm it was the Whitmore's car. Inside, they found remnants of the family's belongings: a pink hairbrush, a rusted thermos, a child's backpack with a cartoon dinosaur on it, still faintly visible. No remains, but enough to know the truth. The Whitmores hadn't abandoned their life. They hadn't run away. They had simply disappeared into the forest, lost in a hidden corner of the world no one thought to search. No one, except Max. Ellie watched as the officers somberly collected the items. The forest was quiet again, but the weight of the moment pressed down like snowfall. Later, as they prepared to leave, one of the rescuers turned to Ellie and asked, "How did you know where to look?" She didn't answer at first. She looked back toward the road, toward Max. "He showed me," she finally said. The man followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "Dogs, they don't forget." Max didn't move when Ellie returned to him, but this time when she sat beside him, she noticed a change. He wasn't as rigid. His body seemed lighter. Not relaxed exactly, but no longer clenched in silent agony. For the first time since she met him, Max shifted his eyes toward her. Not long. Just a glance. But it held volumes. Ellie whispered, "They're not lost anymore, Max." She didn't know if he understood the words, but she could feel something passing between them. Acknowledgement, relief, maybe even gratitude. Max had kept watch over that road, day and night, in the cold and rain, through seasons and storms, because he remembered, because he knew someone had to. He had waited not just for his family, but for someone to come and see, to listen, to believe him. And Ellie had. He couldn't speak, he couldn't write. But in his stillness, in his relentless presence, Max had told a story the world nearly forgot. The story of love that refused to fade, of a family gone but never abandoned, and of a dog whose loyalty became the map that led them home. The days that followed the discovery of the Whitmore's car unfolded like a dream that belonged to someone else. News crews arrived first, their vans pulling up just before sunrise, setting up tripods and microphones at the edge of the road where Max still sat, solemn and unmoved. Then came the reporters, some quiet and respectful, others more intrusive, with camera flashes and overly rehearsed voices trying to capture something far deeper than they could articulate. By then, the story had already gone national. Loyal dog waits 2 years at scene of family's disappearance. The headlines were everywhere. People shared pictures of Max with captions like "True love knows no words" and "A hero with 4 legs and a heart that never gave up." In a matter of hours, Max became a symbol of devotion, of loss, of something ancient and pure that no tragedy could extinguish. When the recovery team returned to the crevice 2 days later and found the remains, fragments of bone and fabric buried deep within the wreckage, the truth became undeniable. The Whitmores hadn't simply vanished. They had died that day, lost to the earth, buried beneath silence and time. Their story had nearly ended there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, but Max had refused to let them be forgotten. The small town held a memorial near the road where lanterns were lit and left floating down the dried creek bed. People brought flowers, notes, candles. Children left drawings of Max sitting by a tree, his eyes full of hope. No one could explain how a dog could remain in the same place for so long, through harsh winters, wild storms, hunger, and isolation. But no one doubted that he had done exactly that. Max had witnessed what no one else had. He had mourned alone while the world moved on. He had waited. And now, with the truth finally unearthed, the question became, what happens to Max? A distant cousin of the Whitmores, a woman named Caroline who lived 2 towns over, volunteered to adopt him. She was kind and patient, and the officials handling the case agreed it made sense. She arrived with treats and a soft voice, kneeling beside Max and gently calling his name. But Max didn't move. She tried again. Days passed. Caroline visited him each morning and afternoon, bringing blankets, toys, even a piece of clothing that had once belonged to the Whitmores, hoping the scent might stir something in him. Still, Max stayed. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't afraid. He simply refused to leave the spot he had guarded for 2 long years, his eyes still turned toward the forest, though now less intense, more wistful, as if he knew the chapter was closing, but hadn't yet let it go. Ellie returned one afternoon to find Caroline standing a few feet away, watching Max with a mix of compassion and helplessness. "I don't think he's waiting anymore," Caroline said softly. "But he hasn't chosen to move on." Ellie understood immediately. That evening, she came alone. The sun had just dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in tones of amber and lavender. The trees whispered above as Ellie approached, her footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. Max was there, in his place, but something about him looked different, softer, tired. Ellie didn't say anything at first. She simply sat beside him in the growing dusk, the quiet between them now familiar, almost comforting. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph she had found in the Whitmore file, a snapshot of Lily hugging Max in the back seat of their car, both of them grinning. She placed it gently on the ground in front of him. "I found them, Max," she said, her voice low and trembling. "You showed me where to look. You brought them home." For a moment, Max didn't react. Then, slowly, so slowly Ellie almost didn't notice, he turned his head toward her. His body shifted, stiff limbs rising with effort as he stood for the first time in days. Ellie froze. Max stepped toward her, steady but tentative, as if testing the ground beneath his paws. When he reached her, he leaned in and brushed his nose against her hand, warm breath fanning over her skin. Then, gently, he licked her fingers. Once, softly, like a whisper. Ellie's eyes welled with tears. It was the first sign of affection he had shown to anyone. And it said everything. "Thank you. Goodbye." Max looked up at her, and in that gaze, Ellie saw a world of emotion. Grief, peace, release. He was no longer watching for someone to return. He had seen them off, had fulfilled the only purpose he had left. And now, he was free. That night, Caroline returned with a leash she never needed to use. Max walked beside her, quiet and calm, as they made their way to her car. Ellie followed them to the edge of the road, her heart full and heavy all at once. As they drove away, rain began to fall, soft and steady, like the sky itself was weeping with relief. The streetlights cast golden halos on the wet pavement, and through the window, Ellie caught one last glimpse of Max. He was curled up on the seat, eyes half closed, breathing slow. He looked at peace, and Ellie, standing alone beneath the whispering rain, knew she would never forget him. Max hadn't just waited for his family. He had waited for someone, anyone, who would see him, listen to him, believe him. And in the end, he got all three. Not in words, not in bark or howl, but in stillness, in silence, and in a single tender lick that said everything a heart could ever say. Ellie had never expected to find peace. After the discovery of the Whitmore's remains, after the endless media attention and the silent grief that accompanied the recovery, she thought she would feel a sense of closure. Instead, she found herself sitting in the soft glow of twilight, holding a tattered collar in her hands, as memories of Max and the family he had faithfully watched over continued to swirl in her mind. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but every visit, every quiet moment by his side, added layers of meaning she hadn't anticipated. Max had been placed in Caroline's care after that night, but he wasn't the same dog who had arrived 2 years ago. He was calm now, his once steely eyes softened with the gentleness of time. His body no longer seemed tense, no longer chained to the past. There was a peace in his movements, a steady rhythm in his breaths, as if his mission had been completed. But for Ellie, the ache of what he had carried remained, an echo of loyalty that could never truly fade. Max's new home was small but warm. Caroline's house, nestled at the edge of town, sat in a quiet neighborhood shaded by trees that had witnessed more seasons than most could count. Every time Ellie visited, she would find Max resting in the yard, lying peacefully on the cool grass, looking up at the sky with a serene expression. It was a far cry from the days when he had waited tirelessly by the side of the road, his body rigid with the tension of longing. Yet, despite the calm that seemed to have settled into his soul, there was something about Max that never seemed to change. It was his eyes, the deep, soulful brown eyes that, no matter how many months had passed, still held a quiet sadness, a quiet strength. They were the eyes of a dog who had seen the worst of what the world could offer, but had never stopped believing in something greater than himself. Ellie could not help but visit often. Each time, She sat beside him, watching as he rested beneath the shade of the large oak tree in Caroline's yard. The wind would rustle through the leaves above, and Max would look up, his gaze following the movement of the branches as if recalling something far away. Every so often he would raise his head and glance at Ellie, as if checking on her, making sure she was still there, still part of the world he was learning to trust again. It was during one of these visits, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard, that Ellie reached down and picked up a familiar object, the old, rusted collar. It had become a symbol of sorts, a memento of Max's unwavering devotion, a token of the family that had been lost, yet never truly gone. She had kept it all this time, tucked away in her bag. But now, as the soft evening light touched the collar's faded surface, it felt right to bring it out. Ellie ran her fingers over the rough leather, the worn edges, the faint engraving of Max that had somehow managed to survive years of neglect. As she held it in her palm, the memories of that long, quiet night on the mountain road returned to her with an intensity that took her breath away. Max had sat there for so long, watching the road, waiting for a family that would never come. And yet, in doing so, he had given them back the one thing they had lost: remembrance. He had given them a voice, one that had been silenced for too long, and in doing so, he had ensured that they would never be forgotten. Ellie wiped her eyes as the tears threatened to fall. The weight of everything, the discovery, the loss, the healing, suddenly felt too much to carry. But as she sat there with the collar in her hands and Max beside her, something shifted. The grief was still there, sharp and present, but now there was space for something else, a quiet understanding, a gentle peace that had been growing within her over time. Max had waited, yes, but in the end, it wasn't just for the Whitmores. He had waited for someone to listen, to see him, to honor what he had witnessed. He had waited for the moment when the story could be told, and the love that had been lost could be remembered. Max's tail wagged softly as he nudged Ellie's hand with his nose, as if to remind her that it was okay to let go now. She smiled through the tears, her heart swelling with a gratitude she didn't know how to express. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't just a thank you for finding the Whitmores, for bringing them back. It was a thank you for showing her how love could survive in the most unlikely places, how loyalty could endure even after death, after time, after silence. As the days passed, Max's health slowly began to decline. The years of waiting, of holding on to the past, had taken a toll on him, as it often did with those who lived with such quiet burdens. But Ellie knew that his journey was ending, and as much as the thought pained her, she understood it was time for him to rest. The night he passed, Ellie was sitting by his side, just as she had so many times before. Max's breathing was shallow, his body warm but weakening. She placed the collar gently beside him, as though offering a final tribute to the dog who had given so much. The rain began to fall softly, a steady drizzle that seemed to wash away the remnants of the day. Max's eyes fluttered, and for a moment he looked up at her, his gaze full of a quiet understanding. In that moment, Ellie felt something stir deep within her, a connection, a bond that reached beyond words. Max had waited for this moment. He had waited for someone to understand his pain, to witness his love, to remember the family he had guarded so fiercely. And now, as he slipped peacefully into the night, he was no longer bound to that road, to that place of loss. He was free. As the rain continued to fall, Ellie whispered her goodbyes. And in that quiet, sacred moment, Max's mission was complete. He had found peace. He had ensured that the love of the Whitmores and his own would never be forgotten. The next morning, as the world slowly woke from its slumber, Ellie stood at the edge of the yard, gazing out at the hills beyond. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the scent of earth and renewal. Max's collar, now a cherished memory, lay in her hands, a symbol of a love that had transcended time, loss, and the silence that had once enveloped them all. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the quiet, empty yard, Ellie knew that Max had done more than wait. He had kept alive a love that would never die, a memory that would never fade. And in doing so, he had given them all something priceless, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love endures. Even when we think something is lost forever, it may just be waiting for someone to listen. Thank you for joining me here on Veil Marks. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and consider subscribing to the channel. With your support, I can continue creating more meaningful, deeply moving content. Remember, as the famous author C.S. Lewis once said, there are no happy endings because nothing ends. Just as Max's love did not end, neither does the lesson he shared with us. Through his unwavering loyalty and love, we learn that even in the darkest moments, there is light, and that light is found in the memories we cherish and the bonds we create. Don't miss out on more inspiring stories. Subscribe and be part of a journey that will touch your heart deeply.